After you've determined where you want to go, determine how you're going to get there. This is the truth that must be emphasized repeatedly during the sermon so that the hearers will have a lasting imprint on their minds. And let me say, this has helped a lot of Sunday school teachers that are not pastors too. This course will help them be effective in their teaching a Sunday school class. Write the truth down and really look at it. Be certain you are convinced that the decision you want made can be accomplished by the method you have chosen to accomplish it. So the first thing, you want to determine, what do I want to accomplish by this sermon? Then how am I going to get there? And then picture in your mind people surrendering to what you're doing, yielding to what you're doing. And then it's good to go that fourth step and picture how God's going to bless them for doing it. For instance, tithing. I believe that every Christian should tithe. And I believe God will bless them for tithing. So if that's what you're wanting to teach, you say, this is what I want to teach. This is how I'm going to teach it. Picture the people accepting that message. And then in your mind, before you ever preach, picture how they're going to be blessed by doing what you say to do. And that's true whether you're teaching a truth or whether you're preaching a message. Number 3. By the way, I just said in number 2, you must be convinced of the truth. I know of pastors, preachers that don't tithe. I know of some that don't. They don't tithe. Well, how are you going to preach a sermon on tithing if you don't know it yourself? The reason you don't tithe is because you don't believe God will bless you. And you've got some other way. You say, well, I'm going to use my money this way instead of other way. You've convinced yourself of that. But it's going to be hard for you, if you're not convinced, to convince them. If you're selling something, if you're not convinced that you've got a good product, it's going to be difficult to convince them it's a good product. You understand what I'm saying? Verse number 3. Look carefully at how you're going to accomplish what you desire, and be certain that the method you have chosen will accomplish what you desire. Number 4, convince yourself of the importance of the one great truth you're going to preach. You should be convinced you have a great truth the congregation needs and must have to be a better Christian. Now, you've got to be convinced of it. You've got to be convinced, I'm going to help them. Boy, what I'm going to preach to them today, what I'm going to teach to them today, it's going to help them. It may be an evangelistic message, and you're preaching to lost people. The same truth is there. You've got to be convinced, boy, if they will respond, their lives can be changed. I mean, not only will they go to heaven, they can have a better life right here. So you've got to be convinced that the truth you're going to be preaching or teaching will help the people. The message you're going to teach needs to be the most important thing on your mind as you meditate and prepare for it. Be totally consumed with the importance of the message. Remind yourself repeatedly during the week of one great truth you desire to leave with the congregation. For instance, if you want the congregation to grasp the truth, positive thinking brings positive results, write the truth down and look at it often during the week. Make it an indelible part of you by thinking of it a portion of every day. Put it on the top of your prayer list daily. So be convinced of it, remind yourself of it, sell yourself on it, and then you'll be more effective in convincing them. But remember, one great truth. Don't try to teach them everything there is. If you want to be, and remember the title of this lesson is Preaching Effectively. Not becoming a good preacher, not becoming a dynamic speaker, but being effective. And by effective, I mean you're wanting to help people and you have a means that you want to help them. It should be focused on helping them and not, boy, they said, Tisdale, that was a great message you preach. That's not the goal. The goal is that you want to help them, not them to say, boy, that's great. Number 5, visualize. Somebody said, what you visualize, you can realize. Visualize the people responding during the invitation and the change it will bring in their lives. Meditate on the truth and think of ways it will help the hearers. Now, getting down to preaching it, getting ready to preach it. Remember, you've already determined what you want to preach. Now, how are you going to put the sermon together? Read all you can about the truth. Read or listen to sermons others preached emphasizing the truth. Refer to commentaries, books of illustration, or your own concordance to learn all you can of this one great truth. So, to prepare yourself, start studying. Read material about it, and you'll get some thoughts from it. You might get a good outline from somewhere, reading some sermon outline book or something. You may get a good outline, or you may get a good thought or a good illustration. But you start reading what are listening to other sermons on that topic, and that will give you some ideas that you will preach because you want to convey that one great truth to your congregation. Number 7, remember that you only have one chance to deliver the truth to that congregation. More than likely, this will be the only opportunity some of the hearers will ever have to hear the one great truth you are to deliver. This should help motivate you to do your best and be your best. Now, what am I saying here? I mean, I don't know how many attend y'all's church over there at Sullivan City, but let's say you have 40 people. More than likely, that's the only time that exact group is going to be there as you preach on that subject. You may preach that subject in a year from now again, but maybe some of those will be out that day. So remember that Sunday that you're going to preach this is probably the only chance you're going to have to preach to everyone that's right there. So you want to be sure that you do your best and that you be your best. Now, some of you preachers, you mind if I just tell you be your best? It means you should look your best. One time, Dr. Chapa, who I admire greatly, he preached a great message. I heard it, I guess, on the tape or something. And when he got through, I sent him a note. I don't think you'll mind me telling you, but I said, brother, you should have given an invitation. And he didn't that day. But because it was a tremendous message he brought, maybe there was nobody unsaved listening to him right then, but there's no telling who was listening to him out there in TV land. And so you want to be sure that every chance you do your best, you be your best, because you don't know who's listening, and this might be their last chance. And that puts a lot of weight and importance on the preacher. Because, boy, I want to see it effective. And whatever the truth is you're teaching, and I mentioned earlier tithing. It may be somebody's listening out there, and this is the only chance they'll get. So give them an invitation, a chance to surrender to it. Because you know what happens if you don't? It'll happen with them, and it'll happen with you and most of your congregation. As soon as they leave, they'll say, they'll shake hands with the preacher and say, Brother Tisdale, that was a great message. That was really a blessing to me. But as soon as they get out in the car, they get thinking, boy, I hope Luby's has the chicken fried steak that I want today. And the old devil will come, and it may have been a sermon on tithing, and they may be thinking about it. But as soon as they leave, the old devil will come and snatch that thought from their mind, and they won't think of it again. And so you want to try to get a commitment from them while they're there. And brother, what I'm telling you, I've been preaching a long time. That happens, and that happens to all of us. and it happens to you. You hear a great sermon perhaps on souls dying and going to hell, and it burns you, it breaks your heart. You may cry when you're hearing it, and then you leave and you go eat a double quarter pounder, and you don't even think about it because it didn't bother you at all then. You forget about people dying and going to hell. You see what point I'm making? So you want to get them while they're there to make a decision. Number 8, avoid complicated outlines. One of the great problems with sermon outline books is they're too complicated. And most preachers that I know of, their preaching is too complicated, and they're ineffective with their congregation. Let me show you what I mean. Complicated outlines usually give the hearers too much to remember. Never forget that if the hearers cannot remember the message, it will do them little, if any, good. A complicated outline is one with Roman numeral 1 and then 3 or 4 subheads. Then Roman numeral 2 and 3 or 4 subheads. And you go all the way down. And it might be that, and by the way, they teach you that in some of these Bible colleges and seminaries you go to. But the guys that are teaching it have never pastored a church. They don't know how to communicate a truth. So they're bringing a sermon that is homiletically correct, but it's not effective. Believe me, what I'm telling you will help you if you'll put it in effect. But these outlines, Roman numeral 1, then 3 or 4 bullet points. Roman numeral 2, 3 or 4 bullet points. Looks real good, but they're not going to remember it. And so as a result, that preaching is not effective. It may have been a beautifully outlined preaching, but it wasn't effective. Let's go on. Number 9. Write boldly the truth somewhere in the outline so you will be reminded of it. You can highlight it or circle it or underscore it to make it stand out. I often on my outlines, and sometime I'll show you the way I do my outlines, but I have the one great truth, sometimes several places in it, and aside, I will write down to keep myself on target of that one great truth, what it is, and I may highlight it, circle it, mark it, so that I'll be reminded of that for me to remind it, okay? Number 10. If the sermon you're preaching does not have one great truth, sometimes you'll preach something that there's not one great truth. Have some illustrations that the hearer will remember. Remind yourself that the hearers will not remember most of what you're saying. Like it or lump it, that is the way it is. They're not going to remember most of what you say. And you better accept that fact. Don't put yourself down. That's just the way it is. If you do not have one great truth to repeatedly emphasize, then leave them with something they can chew on during the week. It might be some illustration that's dynamic, and they'll be thinking about that during the week. I'm going to share an illustration after a while from a sermon that I heard probably 50 years ago, and I don't have any idea what the sermon was, but that pastor left one illustration that I've used many times in these 50 years, but I remember that. Don't remember what the sermon was, and I'll share that in just a minute. Number 11, if you're preaching a sermon that has several points, it is effective to repeat the previous points as you introduce a new one. Those of you that have heard me preach a lot, and if you've heard Debbie teach, she's taken my class, but what I do, I have usually one truth that I'm teaching, but I may use several things to illustrate that truth. And I may say point. Maybe it's on prayer, and I can't, my mind wasn't thinking of it, but say point 1 about, I want people to pray. Point 1 is God commands us to pray. And then I preach on that. And then number 2, God blesses us for praying. But when I preach on point 1, I said, now, first of all, I want you to understand God commands us to pray. And then point 2, after I preach that, and I say, now point 2 is, now remember I said point 1, I go back to remind them. Point 1 is God commands us to pray. Point 2 is God blesses us when we pray. And then I preach on that. And then I go to number 3, and I, point 3 maybe God answers prayer. But before I say, now point 3 is this. But remember I said, point 1, I said God commands us to pray, and God blesses us for praying. And point 3 is God will answer our prayer. And I gave you just something there. But I go back to remind them, before I go to the next point, I use it subtly and say, I bring it in, and when I get through, I keep bringing it in, because repetition is a good way to give that thought to them. That's my method. Now, if you're preaching a sermon that has several points, it is effective to repeat the previous points as you introduce a new one. Just as I said, repetition is particularly important in public speaking. Many have found it helpful to have the congregation repeat the points aloud. Now, point 1 is, and get them to repeat it. Number 12, as you are preaching the sermon, do not change directions if you feel you're not being effective. We've all been tempted to do that. We're preaching and it just doesn't seem like it's going across good, and we're tempted to go a different direction. The veteran preacher has learned that at times when he thought he was not effective, that God was using the message as He intended to. If you have prayed about the message, meditated on it, visualized the desired results, and prepared adequately, preach what you believed God wanted you to preach, and trust Him to accomplish what He desires. Don't change halfway along. We'll wait just a minute here. Don't change. Just stay with it. And you'll find out that sometimes when you went home and you thought, man, I bombed out today, somebody will call you during the week, or somebody will tell you that night, Pastor, you don't know how much that helped me. And you thought you'd bombed out, and you may have been tempted to say, well, I'd better go some other direction because I'm not getting across to them. But you'll find out that even though you thought you were not effective, you were. Now let me give you an illustration. It's not part of this lesson here, but to show you that sometimes when you've got a message that you're just preaching, perhaps you're teaching a passage of Scripture, and there's not one particular thought that you want, but you're just teaching the Bible there, but you want to leave them with something they can think of. Years ago, over 50 years ago, I heard a sermon preached by my pastor. I don't know what he preached on that day, but I do remember this, an illustration that he used. He said, a man, a farmer, hard-working farmer, had a son that went astray. And that son went out like the prodigal son, and he went out into the far country. And later, that son had lost everything, and he got sick with an incurable disease, and he came back home to die. And that son told his dad before he died, he said, Dad, you see that gate post out there at the edge of the house? And he said, every day, he said, Dad, what I want you to do is at that gate post, I want you to put a little marker on that gate post. Because every day when you leave, I notice early in the morning, you get up and you go through that gate post right there, and you go out and you milk the cows and you take care of the animals. And then you come back in later to the house, and Mama has breakfast for you, and you cross through that gate post and you come back in the house. You come in and eat breakfast, and then after you get breakfast, you go back out through that gate post, and you go out into the field, and you work all morning. And after you worked all morning, you come back to the house, and you pass through that gate post right there, and Mama has lunch ready for you, and you eat breakfast. Well, after you eat, she fixes lunch for you. After you eat your lunch, then you go back to work the rest of the afternoon, and you pass through that gate post, and you go back out to the fields, and you work there all afternoon. And then after you've worked the rest of the day, you come back into the house through that gate post, and you come back into the house for a few minutes, and you rest for just a little while. And then you go back. Mama fixes supper for you, and after you have supper, then you go back out through that gate post, and you go in and you tend to the animals, and you take care of the animals, and then you come back in through that gate post, and you come back in the house to go to sleep. He said, Dad, I want you to put this mark on that gate post so that every day, every morning, every time at noon, every time you pass through that gate post, you remember that you had a son that lived, got sick, and died, and he never heard his daddy pray. I remember that illustration for a long time. And that is a great illustration when you're trying to teach men the importance of praying. Here was a boy that died, and he said, I want you to remember every day that you had a son that was born, that lived, and died, and never heard his daddy pray. If you have a message that doesn't have one great point to it, doesn't have one main point to it, if that's what the message is, if it doesn't have one great truth, then you want to leave them some kind of illustration that they can think about and chew about all week long that'll help them become more like what God would want them to be. Amen?